getting to the point now where we have enough speakers externally and internally that we may go the way of 2 calls. But for now, we will try and keep people strict to their 15 minutes as part of their presentation. If this is your first Microsoft Graph community call, you can sign up and register for our monthly calls either by using the ak.ms link above there, or going to the Graph Explorer and the calendar samples and clicking on there, and you can actually kind of play with the graph to add that to your calendar as a recurring event. Next month will be on December 4th, and we've got a good lineup of speakers for that session as well. Today, we're actually going to be giving a few updates on some new initiatives the team are working on. And then Paul is going to go through and talk about PowerShell and the Microsoft Graph from his experiences with customers out there in the field. Abram Jackson is going to actually working with, who's kind of the lead PM working on Microsoft Graph Data Connect, is going to give us a nice overview of the Microsoft Graph from a Data Connect perspective scenario. And then we have a vendor, Cards for Pro, that have been building on top of the Microsoft Graph. They're going to share some of the lessons they've learned from building on the graph in their time in shipping products into the Microsoft ecosystem. And then we'll have time, hopefully, for Q&A at the end. But as I say, getting through 3 particular presentations might be a little bit tough, and we might have to squeeze at the end. So apologies if I'm screaming through the intros here. From a graph updates perspective, the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about was that something that was announced at Ignite is that we now have the ability to see the new preview app registration portal inside of the Azure portal. If you go to the aka.ms link, what we demoed at Ignite was essentially this notion of being able to very easily create the application, and much more improved experience of actually searching for and adding permissions to those applications by kind of typing in mail and calendar.read, and it instantly coming up with those permission scopes. So if you haven't had a look at that preview, please go check that out. There is a blog post popping out later this week to announce that, but that link does actually work right now. So for the people on the community call, we get the benefit of kind of checking those things out. You would have noticed that already if you've got in the portal.azure.com and seen that there is now a app registration blade list item as well as a app registration preview list item. In addition to that, Brian Jackett actually took the initiative to reach out to our team and talk about this notion of building a series of blog posts that the conversations that he has with his customers, both in North America and globally, around the Microsoft Graph. And what we've actually got to is a 30-day series introducing a variety of different things on the graph, with both engineering PM leads writing particular blog posts, as well as MVPs and some other people in the community writing blog posts as well, to talk about the things that they do and use on the graph for the business scenarios they have in the real world. So if you haven't checked out that series, the aka.ms/30 days MS graph is the right place to go. We do have now finally support, if I just launch this link, in our blog, because it's not really a blog without it, is an RSS feed. So if you are using things like Feedly or Google Reader or anything like that, you will be able to do that. And the security on my PowerPoint is extremely strict today, so I'm just going to go to it a different way. Wow. There we go. When in doubt, use Chrome. If I go to the blog in the top here, you'll see that we've got the series, and there's a series of title things just to kind of help those pop out more. So day 6 now, we're talking about query parameters on the graph. But a useful one that we've had a lot of feedback from is why you should learn the graph and how it's important to various different roles, not just developers, but IT roles and business people. Please check that out. And there's a nice video there by Yina that kind of introduces the graph in a very short amount of time. So definitely keep up on that series of blog posts. And then also the podcast that myself and Paul Sharepoint do. We've just recently done one with Daryl Miller and with Abram Jackson, who's presenting today, around Data Connect, and with Nick Kramer from the Microsoft Teams call. So those are kind of more candid conversations that last kind of anywhere between 40 and 50 minutes. that you can fit into your commute or your walk when you take the dog somewhere, or when you're just piecing out at home with a glass of wine or a beer. And it's a great way of learning about kind of what experiences our PMs have when they're shipping their products on the Microsoft Graph, and some kind of tidbits that maybe don't come across in some of these type of presentations or in our documentation. And then Preeti, who presented last month on the community call, just wanted to highlight for us that there is a new PowerShell sample around the Microsoft Graph security APIs specifically. Those links will be in the directly in the slide deck and in the post that we post when we put this on demand. But there are some GitHub repos there under the Microsoft Graph GitHub area for security API solutions. And so if you're interested in checking those security APIs out that Preeti showed last month, that sample has now been shipped. So without further ado, Paul is going to be talking to us about PowerShell on the Microsoft Graph. So Paul, do you want to take over control of the screen, and we'll give you your 15 minutes of time to present what you've learned with PowerShell.
Sure thing. Absolutely, I'd love to. And can you hear me all right, just to double check?
Yes, perfect, yeah.
Alrighty. So my name is Paul Cotillo, and I've worked with Microsoft for just shy of 8.5 years as an Office 365 deployment consultant. And in my role, I work directly with customers that are migrating to M365, and specifically the technical resources that are owning and administering the service for their organization. Now, the typical Exchange, SharePoint, mobility, or just a service administrator in general usually doesn't really have extensive experience with a coding platform or a language like C#. However, they typically know their way around PowerShell pretty well. And with that said, one of the tools that I often use is Microsoft Graph to query different data sources like SharePoint Online, Azure AD, Yammer, and Teams. But I started having some issues a few months ago connecting to different sources when the service began limiting the use of those well-known client IDs. And it really forced me to figure out a new way of doing things and how I could provide guidance to my customers on how they could query the data sources that don't really have those easy-to-use PowerShell modules available. So in my segment, I'm going to show you how to create a native application and query something simple like Azure AD to retrieve all users through PowerShell. Now, as Jeremy was just mentioning, there is a public preview of the app creation or creating an application. However, the screenshots and everything I have are of the pre-app registration preview that's available. So, yeah. And alrighty. So to get started, you first have to create a new app in Azure by going to Azure AD, app registration, and then selecting a new application registration. So the most important part of this step is that you'll need to make sure that you create it as a native application. If you were to create it as a web application, you'll ultimately fail to authenticate with the process that I'm outlining here. And then the redirect URI can literally be anything that you want it to be. It just has to start with HTTPS. So these two steps are pretty critical. I've had actually on the blog, there's a few people that were walking through these steps and failed to create it as a native application and ended up not really using the correct URI when updating the script. But basically, the script has to have the exact URI that you enter here, and if, like I said, if you don't use a native application type, you do end up running into some issues. So once the application is created, you'll need to select the app and modify the API access by setting the required permissions. It is possible to very narrowly scope the use of the application to just specific services and rights. So you'll want to assign the least amount of access required to do whichever the activity is that you are looking to do. So in this case, I selected Microsoft Graph as the API and then the delegate rights of read and write directory permissions, since I'll be using this application to query Azure Active Directory and then later patch and requests to modify Azure AD user attributes like the company name or something like that. And then once that's done, you'll need to actually make sure that you select grant permissions after you've selected the permissions, because if you don't actually select the grant permissions, which is located right there after the fact, it basically just stages the access. It doesn't actually apply the delegate rights at that point in time. So now from a configuration point of view, that's all you really do need to do for the application. Again, just to reiterate, the native application type is really the most critical part, and then remembering the appropriate redirect URI. And then the next step is to just really review and modify the script. And if you're interested, you can download a sample of this code at aka.ms/psh_graph. I know it's a bit of an eye chart, so my apologies there. Hope everybody can read it all right. So to get the script to work, there are a few key variables that you do need to update, and some of them don't actually need to be modified, but the ones that you really do need to be focused on are the client ID, and that'd be the actual application ID of the application that was created. The tenant name is just that, the name of the tenant that you're querying and where the app was created. And the redirect URI is the address that you entered when you created the application. If they are different than what you entered when you created that, the query for the access token will ultimately fail to retrieve that access token as well. The URI is the actual query that you're looking to execute on. So if you're looking to retrieve a list of all the users in Azure AD, you simply execute it with graph.microsoft.com / the version of the API that you're using / users. In this case, I've selected beta since the beta version does return additional attributes that like v1.0 doesn't. And yeah. And then since you want to retrieve all of the users, you're not trying to update anything, you'll ultimately just want to issue the method of get. The other thing, we're under the $URI, that depending on what permissions you assign to it is what access you ultimately have. But you would update that value, like if you're trying to query Yammer or Teams for the developer, like under the developer blogs or the TechNet articles for how to use Graph for any of those particular services. It ultimately tells you what the URI should be if you're trying to like retrieve all groups in Yammer, or if you're trying to retrieve all lists of teams that were created within your tenant. So you just basically rinse and repeat, copy and paste those values into the URI. So once that's all set, when you execute the script, it passes the variables that we updated to the getAccessToken function, which is pretty simple. Basically, it just first checks to see that you have the correct bits installed to support modern auth. From in PowerShell point of view, really all you have to do is have the latest Azure AD module installed. Have the latest Azure AD module installed, and so it'll check to ensure that you have those bits installed, and then it passes the appropriate attributes to the acquired token async. If the credentials and everything check out, it returns the auth results and ultimately the access token that's necessary for access. Also, when the function is executed, it does prompt with the modern auth experience. So if you have multi-factor or MFA or conditional access enabled in your tenant, you won't get any type of access issue denied because you're attempting to auth with any type of legacy auth, since it does support multi-factor auth. Once the access token is acquired, it calls the function invoke msGraphQuery and passes the token, the URI query for all users, and the method of get. The function itself executes the invoke REST method, which I believe is part of the Azure AD modules that you can install for PowerShell. And then at that point, it just batches through the requests at a default of 100 users per request until there's no more users left to retrieve. And so all in all, it's pretty simple to query Microsoft Graph through PowerShell. What I really like about this approach is it doesn't really require any kind of a cumbersome code editor to be installed on your workstation, and can just be executed using a scripting tool that most administrators are really familiar with. It's also easy to be modified and query other data sources as long as you do have those delegated permissions. So just in general, it's pretty quick and easy to use for just administrators in general to query those particular data sources. And again, I do have this outlined on the blog, aka.ms_ps8 or aka.ms/psh_graph. It outlines it a little bit more, and if there are any questions, feel free to comment on the blog. And since I own it, I'll keep an eye on it and update it accordingly.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Paul. Hopefully people are already reading that blog post and running that locally on their machines, because this is a super straightforward way of doing this. I actually am sitting with Daryl Miller in the room too, who owns our SDKs, and I thought it might be useful, as well as kind of showing what we can do right now, with the work that Paul's put together with these scripts, of where we're thinking of going, kind of moving forward with the SDKs to even make this even easier for kind of admins. So Daryl, do you want to just share a little bit about that?
Absolutely, sure. Hey, folks. So this is one of the things that we are investigating heavily at the moment. There are quite a few different approaches that folks have taken with regards to PowerShell solutions on the graph. We have community efforts coming from the PNP stuff. We've got another product which I think was called PoshGraph before. There's a variety. We have Intune have code generator stuff that's working with our Viper code gen library, and we also have over in Azure land, we've got the AutoRest people who are code genning PowerShell stuff off of open API descriptions. So we've got a variety of solutions, and it would be good if we could move forward with one consistent solution that provides a richly typed solution across all of the graph that can stay up to date. It's a sort of solving a different problem than this particular solution, because you would need to install a module in order to be able to get at this PowerShell graph, but we definitely do want to get to the point where we have complete coverage of all of the operations using PowerShell. So as I say, this is investigation at the moment. We're looking at the pros and cons of the various different solutions that are available and trying to find what is the right solution for graph. So if people have opinions about what they like, the way PowerShell things are done, or how they don't like things, feel free to reach out to me. I'm gathering all the information I can, and hopefully in the next couple of months, you'll start to see some movement on us in producing a more consistent solution across all the graph.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Daryl. Okay, thanks again, Paul, for that. That was really useful. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to jump on the call to do that. And in terms of time, we'll now hand over to Abram Jackson, who's going to share his story around Microsoft Graph Data Connect. So do you want to share your screen, Abram?
Hey, everyone. Sure, let me do that.
There you go.
Is it all right? Does it see that all right?
Yeah, it's coming up on our screen, so I'm hoping that is for everybody else.
Wonderful. So you guys are all pretty familiar with the graph and the sorts of applications you're already building or have been building or will build. What we see is that a lot of companies are interested in a new class of applications, and this includes analytics and insights kinds of applications. So there's some scenarios on the screen that are all very interesting and high value. We want to make really easy with the graph. We can't build all of these things ourselves, and so we're looking for our community to build out these products for our customers. Some of these common scenarios that we see really often, engage customers, right? See the top sales performer behavior. So identify your salespeople, see what actions they're taking and how they're doing their job, correlate that with your CRM or your sales systems, and identifying what behavior they are doing that's really successful so that you can help your other salespeople to do similar sorts of things. We see in transform products really interesting scenarios to understand the knowledge in your organization, right? The knowledge of an organization is in its communications and in its documents and basically in Microsoft Graph. Being able to understand that and apply that to really help out the business in lots of different kinds of scenarios. We see similar things in Empower Employees. Imagine if you could not just give out diversity and inclusion training, but also analyze the results and see how that is helping the employees be more inclusive. Similar kinds of things in optimizing operations. So all of these, right, these are really next level kinds of things. When we talk about digital transformation of really getting the value out of Microsoft Graph, there's really incredible scenarios that are possible. In analytics and insights across Microsoft 365, we have a few different solutions available for our customers. We have workplace analytics for decision makers, which right out of the box immediately starts getting high value insights into the transformation of an organization's culture. Similarly, with connections into Power BI, business analysts can do quite a bit here, and you guys have seen a lot of these capabilities. But today I want to talk about developers. You guys being able to build your own applications with Microsoft Graph Data Connect. So your own kinds of analytics and insights applications across the scenarios we just talked about, or other kinds of scenarios as well. So you guys are very familiar with the two clouds, right? You even just saw both of them in that last demo. We've got Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Graph as the unified API into Microsoft 365. And there's Microsoft Azure. So you also saw that in that last demo. In terms of creating the application, we know that Microsoft Azure, right, is the productive, the hybrid, the intelligent, and the trusted cloud, and has incredible capabilities for working with data and artificial intelligence and analytics and insights. So what we want to do is combine these two clouds, allow you to get the data from Microsoft Graph very easily into Microsoft Azure for you to be able to work with those data and AI services. So what Data Connect does is it gets the data from Microsoft 365, a lot of it that's necessary for analytics or insights, brings it into Microsoft Azure, where you get the advantages of the Microsoft Azure cloud. Some of the problems that you'd run into if you're trying to do this before Microsoft Graph Data Connect is it's very, very expensive to build up this scale system, right? You guys may have run into just how difficult it is once you want more than 10,000 rows for Microsoft Graph. You get pretty fun challenges, and you get to spend a lot of time engineering this complicated extract, transform, load pattern if you're going to try to do this yourself. Another issue that we see from a lot of our customers is data privacy. Even if you do build this data access at scale system, it's pretty tricky to convince, especially the larger enterprises, to deploy it. Because now they need to trust you and enter into contract with you for how you're going to handle all of their data. The same goes for data governance and security. A lot of our ISVs spend a lot of their time just engineering and building data governance and security systems, and often they need to do so for lots of different industries, and they need to follow certifications from many different industries, and they end up spending a lot of their time on data governance and security. So Microsoft Graph Data Connect, we want to address these three issues. So that for data access at scale, and this is part of what I'm going to demo is you don't need to build a complicated, parallelized, carefully planned and engineered scale-up system. We want to handle that for you, so you don't need to worry about it. In data privacy, we've got a bunch of additional capabilities so that administrators have a lot more control over what data you are getting, and we'll take a look at some of those capabilities that they have. And data governance and security, we're using a model that allows the customer to see for the entire application lifecycle where the data is going, how it's being handled, and to have control over it throughout that process. Okay, one more description slide. This is the technical one, and then we'll get into the demos. So you guys are most familiar with the Microsoft Graph APIs, right? The existing mechanisms, whether you're accessing it through PowerShell or or through the SDKs or another language, the RESTful APIs. So you're pretty familiar with how this works, right? For access scope, you have a user consent or you have the tenant consent. With Microsoft Graph Data Connect, you get access not just to a single user or the entire tenant, but a group of users. And so this allows you to do things like just the sales org or just the operations team. With the APIs, it returns real time within a second or two, right? And you've got the records that you specifically called for. With Data Connect, you set up a definition of what data you want, you set up a schedule, and you get all of that data on whatever schedule you'd like. With the APIs, you get both create, read, update, delete operations. Now with Data Connect, we're just getting the data over into Azure. So this is actually creating a copy or a cache of the data in Azure. And so updating this copy or updating this cache, of course you can do so. It's under your control, but it is not updating the master. And so the master in Microsoft Graph remains the same, and the user experience remains the same even if you delete that copy. For data protection, I'm not sure if we'll get too much time to go into this, but we have protection extended into this copy of data so that the customer can keep control over it. And you can look at our documentation about that because we won't be able to get into a demo for it in this limited time. We talked about the consent a little bit, right? For a per user sort of application, the user can consent to their own data use, as long as the administrator has allowed that. For Data Connect, this is an administrator-only function. We don't want individual, giving up the data. They're not responsible for their colleagues' data. In the granularity, and we'll show a little bit of this, right? So you get permission to the assigned end user or the whole tenant for a specific resource type, whether it's mail.readwrite.all. In Data Connect, your application can be developed for specific groups of users. So if you just want the sales folks, you can get granularity just to have read permission on the sales folks. In addition to mail.readwrite.all, you can actually specify individual properties, right? So if you're building a product that doesn't need the body content, you do not have to request access to it. And if you don't, your application just cannot read it, which helps when you're trying to sell this to a conservative organization, that they don't have to trust you with the content of the messages. I'll also show you this capability where the administrator can exclude users that you've requested. And then the access tool is Azure Data Factory, which I want to demo for you next. So if you guys haven't used Azure Data Factory before, it's a resource just like many others in Azure. So you just create a data factory. And I'm going to show you an example of one of these pipelines. This is what I ran earlier. So this is a pretty simple copy data activity. Actually, let me just create a new one while I'm at it so you guys can see how that works. So this is an activity that copies from one big data system to another big data system. I've already selected a data set here, but let's go ahead and look at what this is. So this is a data set specific to Office 365, and these are the new items here. So we created a connection to Office 365, and I'll take just a real quick look at that. You see service principal and service principal key. So if you guys aren't already familiar with applications through the preview of the application portal, the application demo that you just saw, we are also using that same mechanism. So I hope you guys are, if you're not familiar with that, starting to think about it. Here you can see the data sets that we have while we're in preview: contacts, events, mail folders, mailbox settings, messages, only the sent item messages, and user objects from AAD. So I'll leave that alone without editing it. So we selected that as our source. So we're just getting the sent email messages. And we'll go right into Azure Storage Blob. So I created an Azure Storage Blob instance, specified a path in there. And so this copy data activity is basically ready to go. I just have to publish it and trigger it. If I want to set up a schedule, I can do that right here. But I'm not going to go through all of that. This is standard Azure Data Factory behavior that's been around for a while. But the other thing that I do want to show you is you don't have to use the user, the graphical user experience. Of course, there are ARM templates behind this, JSON defined. It's not very complicated though. I mean, this entire thing, other than specifying the schema of the data that you want, is pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of code in here. The only thing is make sure you understand applications and how applications are granted access to resources. We've got all of this documented in our public documentation. Okay, so say this has been triggered, and I ran one earlier. So we're looking at the storage blob that I created, and I just went into this container. You can see that this container has lots of files. So there are, because this is a big data moving system, in this case I'm only getting mail folders, so it's not actually all that much data, but it's for all of the users in my demo tenant, is what I submitted this one for. And you see here in one of these blobs, pretty familiar properties, right? So we have this is a file of JSON lines, and every line is an object that you would get from the mail folders API from Microsoft Graph. So we have the ID of the mail folder, we've got its display name, we've got the parent folder ID, all of the usual things that you would get from the Graph child folder on unread item count. And a couple of other interesting things here is the P user. This is the user that we are, this is the user object ID that we are getting data from. And P tenant is, you're running this application on many tenants. This property can help you out here too. So that's really it for Microsoft Graph Data Connect. Now that I've got this data in my Azure Storage Blob, I can use any of the Azure services on this. The nice thing about Azure Data Factory is that if you'd like to use Azure Data Factory, you get a lot of capability in what you can do with this data. And the way that this works isn't very complicated either. Say I've already created a Databricks notebook. Just drag it on here. When this completes, we'll execute and read that data and process it into whatever you'd like. So that is it for my demo. I think I'd like to allow a little bit of time for questions on the last part of this meeting.
Thanks, Abram. So in terms of Data Connect, the one question that came up was, in terms of the difference between calling the Microsoft Graph API that's going to give you real-time responses to whatever query or operation you choose on the graph, what is the kind of delay on what data shows up when you're running Data Connect? Is it a 24-hour period, or what's the approach there?
Yeah, so this is designed and optimized for the cases where using the existing APIs doesn't make sense. And so it's really optimized for very large amounts of data. Here to save costs in my demo tenant, I just used a fairly small amount of data, but we want applications that are getting millions of rows or hundreds of millions of rows, and that's really what we've optimized for. And so because we've optimized that way, the initial initial setup can take a little bit of time, something like 30 minutes or so, and then the data begins copying very quickly. And so, the idea is you probably don't want to be running, anything that's like waiting for a user, has a user expectation behind it of running immediately. And we're more interested in, updating reports or systems, every few hours or every 24 hours.
And then in terms of the data that you can get to right now, is that the same as the entirety of the data entities that you can get at if I'm calling the Graph API?
No, while we're in preview, we're focused just on these data sets, basically the mail data sets and the user objects. So right now, that's all that we support. I'd love to get your guys' opinions, in the chat window, or separately, you can contact me on Twitter for what data sets you'd need for your scenario.
Excellent. I think that was all the questions that are coming up here. So with that, we do have one other presenter, but if you have got questions, I know Abram will hang around for the rest of it. So,
oh, actually, I forgot to demo the coolest part. Sorry.
Oh, wait, you have to demo the coolest part.
Do that for 30 seconds. Okay, so I submitted this access request to get these mail items, right? And I showed you that pipeline. So this is Office 365 Privileged Access Management. I'm just looking at the requests that are currently available. And so you see here the user that requested it, the table that I'm getting, and which group I'm getting users or data for, the sales team, the columns that I'm getting, and if you can see this or you do so by PowerShell, you'll see that unique body and body are not included. And finally, if I want them to be able to do this, but not include any messages sent to the executives in sent items, or if I was using the messages data set sent by the executives to these users, that's going to be scrubbed out of here. So the idea here is that it's very easy for administrators to understand exactly what data you're using, to minimize scope, and prevent any, reduce any likelihood of problems. All right, now I'm done.
Awesome, thank you, Abram. Okay, so Paramoy, are you on the call right now? Would you like to share your screen? I believe I've made you a presenter.
Yeah, yes, give me a moment. I'm going to share my screen.
Excellent. While you're doing that, thanks again, Abram. And there was one question I can see in the IM here, specifically around the Teams APIs on Microsoft Graph and the comments around webhooks specifically and rich webhooks for overcoming some of the challenges that are currently being done with the bots API. I will reach out to Nick. There is no news around that right now. They are working very hard to ship the V1 version of the Teams APIs as it currently stands. But we should have news early in January on what we're working towards for the Build conference. And you may have already noticed that we're starting to go through the user voice site and update statuses on feature requests. So if the feature isn't there already in user voice, I'd highly recommend adding it. And then when I go through the triage process with Nick Kramer, who presented last month from Teams, we'll make sure we update the user voices to inform you guys of more nearer dates on when those new features will be shipping. So with that, if you would like to introduce yourself, and we can hear a little bit about how you are using kind of the Microsoft Graph with the Cards for Pro product.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Good morning to all. I am Perumal, co-founder of GG Technologies. I am going to share our story of how we are building Cards for Pro using Office 365. Currently, this product is in private beta, and one of the largest OEM glass manufacturer in US is trying out it actively. So, what is CORSWORK Pro? It is a collaborative and productivity solution built on top of Office 365. It helps you with project and project and process management. And this product is tightly integrated with Office 365, and all your data is stored in your Office 365 tenant itself. That's the main highlight. So this is a simple overview of what is CORSWORK Pro. So you can take any Office 365 resource. It can be a SharePoint file, OneDrive file, any SharePoint list item, whatever it can be. A planner task, a mail from your customer, whatever it can be. You can take any particular Office 365 resource and you can build a card around it with the task management features such as status, assigned to, start date, due date, etc. And also with the current solutions like Planner, where you need to act within the boundary of Office 365 group. But many of our customers are asking for some solutions where multiple teams need to work on a particular task together. For example, when a task is completed by a team, several tasks needs to be started from another team. So there are some dependencies between multiple teams, and also you need to orchestrate these tasks in a simple fashion. For that, you can use CORSWORK Pro. And also you can share a card between multiple teams also. By this you can achieve the process management also. And one of the main asks from the customers is that they want better governance and accountability for all the activities that they do. So what we are doing is that we are log all the activities that you perform on a card. So this is a simple overview of card, and it is a sample view I have. Here you can see the task, you can see the card name and the description on the top right, and then you can see a list of checklists. So once these checklist points are completed, only then the card can be closed. You can link another card or any Office 365 file, resource, anything. Even you can link multiple child cards for this card also. On the left side, you can see all the activity logs. Whatever changes that you perform get logged internally. This is a simple overview or the architecture of CORSWORK Pro. Here we have multiple components like Outlook add-in, OneNote add-in. We have a web client, Teams app, and a Chrome extension also. We are providing multiple extensions so that our customers can work from wherever they are. And all the card details are stored as a SharePoint list internally in Office 365. And for authentication purposes, the Outlook add-in uses the Office.js, and then the other components like Teams app, OneNote add-in, Chrome extensions, and web client uses the MSAL library. And for interactions between the various components and the SharePoint online, we are using SharePoint REST API. And for interacting with the Office components, we are using Microsoft Graph API. So this is a simple overview of the architecture of CORSWORK Pro. So the APIs that we are using are Graph API and the SharePoint REST API. We are using Graph API to interact with the Planner task and the Outlook calendar events, users, groups, OneDrive files, everything. And for interacting with the SharePoint list, we are using SharePoint REST API. Most of our web is built with Angular. And these are the list of JS libraries that we are using. You can see the Graph Client, Microsoft Graph Client SDK, and then we are using the Graph types also, typings also. For authentication, actually I have mentioned earlier, we are using Office.js and the MSAL. And for SharePoint part, we are using SharePoint PNP module, online module. So now I am going to go through some of the pros and the challenges that we faced with the Graph API. So initially we started with a small team. And as days grow, we added new developers into the team. Now and then, every month we add a new developer according to the requirement. So these developers have some basic knowledge of what is REST API, and they have some overview of what is Office 365 also. Using Graph API SDK, the team members got adapted to the Graph SDK within a day, and they are actually contributing to the project from the day one itself. That's the main plus we had. And also most of the developers use Graph Explorer to explore the various how the graph is retaining the values and what are the permissions I want, everything. And another main advantage is that using graph types, we no need to rewrite all the schema interfaces ourselves. It is everything is available in the graph types itself. And also this Graph API SDK is very much adaptable in the Angular framework, and most of our web is in Angular, and this is due to the TypeScript support of Graph API SDK. And each and every permission required for resources are very well documented in the Graph API page. These are some of the pros we had when we are using the Graph API SDK. And then whenever a new version of Graph API is available, we just need to change a single line in the SDK. That's enough. I can move to the new version of Graph API. And whenever a new version of Graph API is made available, we just update it through NPM, and our project never broke. So that's the very cool part. And there are some of the concepts like batching and paging. These are documented on the Graph API page. I highly recommend all the developers to go through it. Paging, page request is used to run multiple queries in a single run. Using this concept, you can improve the performance of your app, and you can use the paging to handle the large return data from Graph API. So these concepts are very well documented in the Graph API page, and we highly recommend all the developers to go through it and use it in your project. And we are using the schema extensions in Graph API to store some of the custom data for the graph resource. That's another cool part. We are pleased with this cool part. And then regarding the challenges we had with the Graph API. Since earlier for all the comments or all the conversations, we thought we can go for group conversations in Office 365 group conversations. But we faced these challenges, like through API, we are able to create only 300 group posts. Whenever we exceed this limit, a new thread got created. And whenever we use the @mentioned in the group post, a new thread got created with the same subject instead of a group post. That's another challenge. And the Graph API returns only the last 100 conversations alone. And top and filter queries are not supported. So what we done is that we moved to the Sharepoint discussion board from group conversations. So you overcome this challenge by using the Sharepoint discussion board. And then if we can't get the member of groups with the group read-write permissions. So in that case, what we have done is that we have overcome this problem using a query, something like that I have shown on my presentation. So another challenge is that to perform any planner related activity, you actually need to provide group.read-write all permissions. What we are actually looking for is that looking for some simpler form of group permission for planner related activities. If it is group.read-write all, the consent that we need to require shows multiple entries, and most of the customers may feel something like why I need to provide this many permissions to you like that. So I know that this is a known issue and it is documented in the Graph API section. We are looking for some solution, and it is this issue exists for a very long time. And then with respect to Graph Planner Task API, while we add a new task to a plan, the task gets created. But when we get the task, the status is returned as 404 in the response. So actually, so the solution is that you require some delay, and you need to repeatedly call the get task API. So this is the one solution we are using, and we observe the same behavior when we create a new group conversation thread also. So these are some of the challenges we faced with the Graph API, and we are highly pleased with the Graph Client SDK, and then there is SharePoint SPO PNP module also. These are the two modules which are highly useful for my developers, and it is making my developers' day easy. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks so much. I thought that was super useful. And Daryl in the room will probably use your slide deck as a way of getting a promotion, being as pretty much everything you said that was a pro is what he owns as a PM here. So I think the things you listed there, Daryl, we've only just shipped a few of those things, like the definitely typed.
So actually, I have a question for the batch requests and paging. Have you tried our new page iterator task and our new batch request content?
Pardon?
In our JavaScript library, we've added some additional support to make it even easier to send batch requests and process the responses, and make it easier to iterate through pages and collections. If you try it out, and I'd love to hear feedback from you.
Okay, sure. I will share the feedback to Jeremy.
That's great. Well, look, I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you so much. So we do have time for questions. Just as a reminder, we do share these meeting recordings on the YouTube channel. And if you go to our Graph blog, just from graph.microsoft.com and click on blog in the top navigation there, we'll actually post those community calls. So I will flip over to the questions in the IM window here to see whether we actually have any other questions that are coming up. Oh, well, actually, I'll answer via voice on the granular permissions for SharePoint site collections. So as some context here for people that might not be aware, the notion is right now when you access things like groups or a planner, you actually have to ask for group read write all permission scope to do that, which we know from speaking to developers that some customers are concerned that the application requests are that broad across all groups. And so there is work going on, which internally we're calling contextual consent, that may change before we go out the door, to allow you to specifically request a permission scope for an individual group and therefore an individual site or an individual team. That work is ongoing, and it has been more complex than we initially thought out. So it has been delayed, but it is something that's actively prioritized by the team. So we are aware of that, and it is being worked on, but it's not something, unfortunately, we have an answer for right now.
Yeah, and I'll add to that we're going to start with groups, and then after we prove the model with groups, we can move to other type of resources like site collections. So the initial release will be scoped to teams and groups only.
Yeah. And then Jeffrey said, we are using growth notifications within a shared mailbox context to track message movement activity. When a user deletes a message, the message goes to their deleted items folder rather than the shared mailboxes. Is there a way to find out that a user deleted a message from a shared mailbox? I will have to, I don't know, do you know that one, Nina? So it's a webhook essentially on a shared mailbox rather than an individual user's mailbox. I would have to just check on that.
Well, the webhook will fire.
Yeah, it should fire if you have the permission scope for the mail.read.shared permission scope. Mm-hmm. So if you aren't seeing that happening on the webhook, Jeffrey, if you can post on Stack Overflow with the Microsoft Graph tag, feel free to mention me on Twitter so I get to it straight away. But we do have a new triage process that we've been running, and we had ice cream in our building yesterday with a bunch of PMs answering those questions. So we are actively working to make sure that we bash through those questions to get answers for you guys outside of these community calls.
And get very fat along the way.
And also get very fat because it was probably 6 liters of ice cream yesterday. We didn't eat it all though.
You ate a lot.
Okay, let's not pick stones here. Okay, ice cream for me is wonderful, yes. Gavin, will you be making it a non-admin consent scenario for users to look at membership of groups that they are part of? Great question.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can, Mark, yeah.
I suspect that the answer to that is a ways out. So, I mean, we're always looking at how do we make this sort of thing better. But obviously when it comes to groups and things like that, then security is a paramount issue. The classical example that always comes up in our org, and I work for the identity org, the classical example that always comes up is, well, hey, if you've got a list or a group called SQL Server admins and you can disclose the membership of that particular group, then, have you introduced an attack vector and given people information? Now, obviously that's mitigated by the fact that in this particular scenario, the user is a member of that particular group. But as far as I know, we haven't budged too much on that. Dan, I think, was also on the call. He might be able to comment with more detail, but I think that's probably a good start at the answer.
Yeah,
probably not for me.
No, you pretty much said it all, Mark.
Yeah. There's always a delicate balance between security and ease of functionality. And you're always going to see us trend more towards being more on the cautious side when it comes to data access security.
Excellent. Well, I don't see any more questions coming through. We're nearly up on the hour. Okay, David said, do we know if the Graph API is planning on adding the ability to get members of SharePoint groups back? So the SharePoint APIs, we haven't had Jeremy Kelly present in this community call yet, who is the PM that kind of owns the SharePoint APIs on Microsoft Graph. There obviously is a large history of APIs in SharePoint, whether it be the CSOM APIs or the SharePoint REST APIs, and now obviously surfacing at Ignite, we announced the Pages API and the List API. And Jeremy is actually actively working on making sure that we get as much coverage of SharePoint on the graph, and it's kind of happening in a priority type order. One thing I'm working with Jeremy on is to kind of have a little bit more visibility of what's coming, and part of that is you as the community providing feedback on what of those things are important. We can do a little bit of that through telemetry to see what are the most common areas of the existing REST and CSOM APIs that are most popular. But also there's kind of strategic things like Pages that have been prioritized from our perspective in telling and engineering. So in the coming weeks, I've got some meetings with Jeremy where we're going to go through and triage the graph requests specifically around SharePoint. And so if you have got specific things like this, David, that you think are important and they aren't already in our Microsoft Graph user voice requested, I'd highly recommend doing that, because we are getting to the point now where we're having the PMs commit to kind of 2 or 3 of those feature requests to ship for the build time frame. And so, it's really important that if you think things need to be built out, that you have those requests in user voice and that people are voting those up. Excellent. Well, look, I appreciate your time today. Just as a reminder, the next call will be December 4th, the last one of the year. Please share this with your colleagues, share this with your friends on social networks. And in the meantime, while you're waiting patiently for the December 4th call, I'd highly recommend checking out the Graph blog for the 30 Days of Microsoft Graph series that Brian Jackett and a bunch of colleagues have been writing around kind of introducing the graph and all the wonderful things you can do with it. So until next time, thanks very much for your time, and thanks to Paul and Abram and Parimal for presenting today.